Thanks for arranging this wonderful webinar. I think most of us who are in the business of science communication always benefit from such to and fro of ideas in the area of science communication, science journalism, things that we learn from scientists and scientists learn from science journalists like myself. So thank you for arranging this. Sorry for the goof up that we had initially, but I think we are all in now. And I bring to you the perspective of a science journalist who's been working in the field for close to, oh gosh, that's been quarter of a century almost. And so that's where I come from. I would probably be speaking from the perspective of somebody who's seen the labs of this country in India inside out and met scientists on a daily basis almost. So for all of you who can hear me, here's a science journalist in front of you who's given her a long number of years into looking at the labs of this country, meeting scientists on a daily basis, trying to unravel what science is happening in this part of the world, in resource-poor settings mostly, but nonetheless some bright pockets of science happening. So I bring to you the perspective also of somebody who has been in mainstream media for a long time, but has come to science out of sheer passion and love of communicating science. So that's very briefly who I am. Here's a small PowerPoint presentation that I made, just so that we are you able to see my presentation now? All right. So why communicate science is the first thing I would like all of us to consider. We all understand that science is happening in some good pockets and some not so good labs or institutes across the world. And so the major problem that science faces in coming out of those labs is lack of communication by scientists or those who pursue science. So why do we need to, in the first place, communicate that science and bring it out of the labs? As you can see, where I've used a picture of a recent famous one from the NSF, from the National Science Foundation of the US, and all of you must be very, very familiar with the picture by now. It's the black hole picture. And why did it make such a big hue and cry? Why did it get across to everybody who's watching this webinar at some point or the other? Everybody must be familiar with that one. So how did that happen? And was communication of that particular science behind it? So why do we need to bring our science out of our labs? Why would you want? And I'm assuming most of the people in this webinar are either scientists or have an interest in science or are communicators of science. So my talk would primarily be taking into perspective the scientists who are willing to or wanting to communicate their science better. Number one reason that we as science communicators think science should be communicated is to squash pseudoscience, which is prevalent in this country at least. And I know that large parts of the world face this problem of pseudoscience being one of the things that creates a problem for scientists and to perpetuate science as it is. So pseudoscience, anti-science beliefs, and of course, we are very familiar with fake news that comes to our desktops, our mobile phones, our WhatsApp messages, everywhere that you will. We are flooded with that kind of news. So one of the reasons why you need to really bring science out is to squash that anti-science, pseudoscience of fake news. You as scientists and we as science communicators have it. It's our responsibility to really scotch that kind of stuff that's happening. The second thing that I can think of, and all of these four that you see on a screen are actually pretty altruistic benefits of communicating your science. Informing the public about your science. What good is science if it is just remaining in your labs? The people have to know about it, about its impact, about how it would impact their own lives, etc. Raising awareness of your discipline. There are some disciplines which are better known in science than others. So it's up to you, scientists, and to us science communicators to really bring up those disciplines that are not known so much, or those ones that have the potential of changing the world but haven't gotten out of where the science is being done at. Inspiring the next generation of researchers. All of us have read a piece of news or a book or a popular science feature at some point of time that has inspired us into either doing science or becoming science reporters, journalists, and editors. And if you look closely or if you think, you will certainly find something or the other that has brought you here, at least to this webinar, that has given you that food for thought in your formative years. And I come to the practical benefits, which really stand out and they are there for everyone to see. Developing a new skill. So by trying to communicate your science, you're not only going beyond just reading your manuscript or writing your manuscript, etc. You're trying to find out what's great about science, what is that thing that can be communicated to people for larger societal impact. So a manuscript looks a certain way or reads a certain way, but when you try and communicate that science to people, when you try and tell that story, that science story, to say a 10-year-old or to your grandma, you will see that you are actually developing a new skill in writing, in speaking, or in purely just going out and doing outreach of your science. Raising the personal or institutional profile of your own or your institution. So that is a very practical fallout of or offshoot of your communicating science. Improving the quality of research. How do you do that? You actually get together with a lot of other people who are doing similar science or transdisciplinary science that could be of benefit to you, and you basically are improving upon your own work by the feedback you get through communicating that science. And networking, again, is very close to improving the quality of your research through feedback. Increasing funding, of course, that's what all of us want, right? As scientists, we want the next tranche of our grants to come in seamlessly. And so if you have communicated or your science is visible, impactful for the society, the next tranche comes easier. Increasing the impact of your work. When you start talking about your work, you would find that many more people start talking about your work too. And by word of mouth, by word of communication, by word of, today you have 1001 means to communicate. So by all of those means, you basically spread that word around and increase the impact of your work. So there you go. You have more than one reasons to start communicating your science. I come very briefly to the power of storytelling. So you see, your science actually can spin into some other story, and there you have on your screen what the black hole looks like to scientists and what it does to, say, a political commentator. So what Brexit looks like from space, it looks like a black hole for some people. So your science is actually telling a story which is hydra-headed, which has got ramifications beyond just your lab or beyond just what could impact scientists or just the wider community. What makes for a good story? This is something scientists always want to know from journalists and vice versa. We always want to know what is a good story in the labs or conferences that we go to. And you always want to know what is it that tickles us, what is it that we as science editors want to feature in our newspapers, our columns, or our blogs. So I'll briefly take you through that, what makes a good story. Number one, in the pitches that anybody can make to an editor or a journalist, or to take your science across to the media, for instance, would be the relevance of your work. So how relevant is your work? News that actually affects people's lives, news that has an impact for people on the streets. For instance, diseases, drugs, climate change, genetically modified food. All of these would fall in the category of relevant news that is instantly a hook for you to talk about your science with a larger audience. Interesting. Results that are unexpected, unusual, or amazing. So, what falls in that category? Stuff like the black hole, the physics, dinosaurs, always enigmatic, always exciting. New species finds, anything that is new that is found out in the recent past. Archaeological finds, which again inspire enigma, often are some things that we are interested in. So if your science falls in these categories, feel free to come across and talk to a scientist, a science journalist, or an editor. Uniqueness of the story. What could be unique? First, something that has been found for the first time, a space finding, something that has been sequenced, for instance, a genome for the first time, the first test tube baby. Wouldn't that be unique and interesting for anybody, for a man on the streets to talk about also, not just an editor or journalist? What else could be unique? Something that is superlative, fastest, strongest, biggest, tiniest, things like that. Newsworthiness. Is your story worth a news piece? Something that's relating to current or topical news, something that's emerging, something that's happening on, say, World Health Day, or say, World TB Day. That would be of interest to an editor or a journalist. Is your science something that involves a celebrity? Is it high impact authors? So authors who have a high impact lend themselves beautifully to a high impact story as well. So they are written about more frequently, if you will notice. Images. I just talked about the value of a great image. A good picture can sell a great story, or even be a story in itself, as we've all seen. What are the effective tools of science communication? And I'll very briefly again touch upon that, and I'll take questions afterwards if you have more. This is a picture from the FAME lab that the Wellcome Trust and Nature India collaborated with the British Council for a couple of years back in India. And we brought these beautiful scientists, wonderful scientists from across the country to communicate their science in 3 minutes. We mentored them and taught them how to talk about their science in just 3 minutes flat. And it was an amazing show to see how people actually came out and communicated their science beautifully. What are the means to do that? What are the tools that you can use? The number one thing that you can use is press releases or press appearances. You could use a press release to communicate your science to the press section of, the editorial section of a newspaper. You can write directly to the editors by way of a letter to the editor, could be an op-ed, opinion piece, a commentary, blogs, your own blog, or on the blog of a news medium. Social media, you can talk about your science there, and there are a lot of do's and don'ts, of course, for using social media. That's the story of another webinar, perhaps. Multimedia, these days, you see so many brilliant videos and podcasts doing that job for you, popularizing science, communicating science. You could write a book, for instance, or a chapter in a book, and try and tell your story. Popular science writing as well. So all of those outreach activity by your own institute or yourself. There are many outreach activities being conducted in this country by individuals who are doing a brilliant job of communicating their science. Public engagement of science. The Wellcome Trust does a phenomenal job of it, and I'm sure the IAVI does something similar in their public engagement through a lot of new things that they talk about their own science to a lot of people. Now, the question is, how do you access the media? Everything looks so distant when it comes to the media. It looks like they sit in hallowed portals and it's very difficult to reach out to them. It isn't the case, really. How do you do that? Now, you can very easily craft a press release from a manuscript. And how are these two different? How are these two forms of communication different? A manuscript is basically something that many of you have written or are in the process of writing, and it's a communication with your peers. How do you turn that into a press release? How do you switch that format? Basically, this is the format on your screen of a manuscript, of a scientific manuscript, which is peer-reviewed or read by your peers. So you get the broad background first, the specific background, the problem or a motivation into your science, the methods, the results, the context of your finding, the conclusion, and then the implications. How do you turn that into a press release which you want to send to an editorial office? You simply bring up the implications, and these are very quickly the tricks of how to format your press release. So what is your conclusion is basically the introduction for a news piece. So your press release should have the conclusion part of your manuscript first. So the conclusion goes first. The key findings of your story go then. Next is implications, the so what question, the relevance of your work. You talk about what the problem is, the context of your finding. If you still have space or the inclination, that would broad background, and there you go. You have your press release just in the format that an editor or a journalist would like to read it as. Most often, the press releases that we receive have still got the broad background on top, the results somewhere down there, and a conclusion, and probably many of them leave out the implications, which is so much important for a press office or a journalist to look at. So how similar are these two professions of a science journalist and a scientist? As you can see, both of us are curious people. Both of us have a hypothesis that we are defending or trying to disprove. Both of us gather evidence to reach there. Both of us want to be read by our audiences. Scientists by their peers, which is a limited number, but journalists, they want to be read by a huge, far larger number than just the scientists' peers. Mistakes for both of us are very, very visible in our work and mortifying, make or mar our credibility, our careers. So you see, we are very, very close to each other in how we operate, how rigorously, and I'm talking about good scientists and good science journalists here. So the process that we each follow is very similar. However, where we differ is a good science journalist is always interested in a story. He wants to tell a story from your science, but the scientist wants a result, however dull it might be. So this is my favorite one. What do you do when a journalist calls you to talk about your story? I hope many of you have reached that stage, or your work has reached that stage when a journalist is trying to contact you, or you have interest from media houses about your work. Even if you don't have, you can reach out to them. And what happens? How do you really go about your work then? How do you communicate? You have to ask first instead of them asking you. And what do you ask? You ask them their name, so that you can review their previous articles. You ask which media outlet they belong to, very basic stuff, but most often we forget whether they are working for the online of that media house, or print publication, or the audiovisual. You have so many different media in a particular media house. So you have to ask about where they belong to, what their deadline is. Is it this evening? Is it tomorrow? Do you have a week's time, so you know how much time you have to prepare for your interview or for whatever stuff you want to send across to them? What is the topic of their story? Is your story central to their topic, or is it coming by virtue of a comment, or just an extra addition to the story, or one head of the story? So know that in advance. So ask. Take time out for going back to your communications office. Have one on how to discuss your study. They would have some pointers to tell you on which key messages you should be flagging off to a journalist or an editor. Do a background check, review, as I said, the journalist's previous work, and try to find out how credible it is, how much factual information is there in his previous body of work, and what are the things you should be cautious of once you read their work, or what much you want to reveal, how much you want to not reveal, stuff like that. So that comes in handy if you do your background check a bit. Prepare for your big interview. Never assume that a journalist or an editor knows everything. They're likely pretty rushed with deadlines hanging on their head, and they're not probably familiar with your field of work. So do prepare yourself so that you can prepare them. This is your interview, so you have to have your key messages typed out, number 1, 2, and 3. Never more than 3. The utmost important ones that you want to tell the story about or spin the story about. I hope I'm within time and sticking to not going too far away. Do not use too many jargons. The shorter your sentences, the more printable your quotes in the first place are, the better chances they have to get printed and not to be misquoted. So minimal jargons, short sentences, understandable from 8 to 80. So that's the age range you're looking at, and a journalist is looking at. Like an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old understands your science, and an 80-year-old does too. That's kind of thing that you have to really keep in mind. Analogies to describe your scientific concepts. So the size of a pinhead, or the breadth of your hair, or the size of a 25 paisa coin. Do we have 25 paisa coins anymore? 50 paisa coin, or a 1 rupee coin, whatever. Half the diameter of a 1 rupee coin. Stuff like that. So analogies are always important for communicating your science better. Why were you interested in this topic? What brought you to this? Why is this science important? What's the impact that it's going to have on the society? What are the important implications or applications of your work? That most likely is the first question you would be asked by a journalist. So you should be prepared by that with that answer. What, very importantly, are the limitations of your study? Was it a lab study done on mice? Is it a phase 3 trial? How long before it can be replicated in humans, etc.? Funding, was it funded by somebody you should be mentioning, we should be giving a disclaimer to or disclosure to? So all of that has to be in place before you are one of the editor or the journalist. The human element is very, very important in your story. Most likely, your story will be woven around that concept of how you came to this science. What is it that excited you? Why should people be interested in this? What was your eureka moment, for instance? Or when is it that you thought it is significant enough to go and communicate your science? What was your how was your, many times you will be asked, how was your family involved in trying and pursuing you into science, or who was the most prominent person in your collaboration, etc. So a lump in my throat, a tear in my eye, that kind of story is always welcome, always adds that extra edge to your story. So thank you for listening, and I'll take questions if you have any later on.
Ida to probably start her session, and we can take the question and answers later together after the sessions.
Hello, everybody. What a wonderful topic to be discussing. I think we can dive straight into my presentation. What I would like everyone to consider today is, as a scientist, you most probably have been frustrated at some of the things that Subhra has been talking about. In other words, frustration about the fact that there's so many myths, there's so much inaccurate reporting, there's simply fake news, and we don't quite understand how it can be, because if your field is tuberculosis, if your field is biotechnology, or whatever specialized field it might be, the facts are completely evident to you, but in the world out there, we have all of this misinformation. If we look at the beginning of the first picture on my presentation, that's a journalist in Kenya going into a really, really modest home in an area where there's a lot of tuberculosis. And he's going with his high-tech TV camera, but he's trying to understand why it is that people sort of can't get out of this mode of living in a home like that, even though it is not helping them, get rid of their tuberculosis. So go to the next slide. I think science and science communication is a head and heart thing. And this is, for me, so lovely about this talk today, is that we're talking across the globe, as far as I'm concerned, not just sub-Saharan Africa and India and Asia, but the entire world. Every single human being has this, but sometimes conflict between the heart and the head. And what we strive for is actually some kind of synthesis between the left brain and the right brain, or logic and the heart. So a key question that I've been considering in the work that I do, which is to help journalists tell the science story, help scientists tell the science story by connecting the two of them, is, why do people believe the things they do? It's, for me, a completely vexing question, and today we will not necessarily discover the answer, but I would like you to consider that if we have a better understanding of why they believe those things, we also have a better way of addressing why it is that people believe those things. We know that we're in a vaccine denial or vaccine hesitancy crisis at the moment. We know that people still deny that certain diseases exist, but why do they believe those things? So one of the most pressing questions in my mind that both journalists should ask, and also the scientists who want to communicate their science. So we go now to an example from West Africa. You know about the incredibly devastating Ebola crisis that lasted almost 18 months and killed the highest number of people ever from Ebola. On the positive side, it's the first time that so many people survived. But nevertheless, even Even though people faced incredible devastation around them, there were still just so many myths about Ebola. Can you all see my slides? Debbie, can people see my slides? Great. So, for instance, one of the myths on Ebola was that, if you pray over salt water and then bathe in it, you will be cured of Ebola. In the following picture, you will see some of the images that appeared on social media talking about an Ebola zombie or zombie. In other words, somebody who's come to life after having died of Ebola. I mean, how is it that there can be such an image and that it can be spread and that some people clearly believe it? In the DRC, where we now have a raging Ebola crisis, alongside a political crisis and violence, one of the myths, one of the beliefs around Ebola is that it is the health workers themselves that are bringing Ebola. Other examples from, I'm sure many of us have encountered people with the belief that a certain hospital killed their patients. In Ebola, both in West Africa and in DRC at the moment, people fear going to those Ebola treatment centers because they say that's where people die. In other words, the treatment center kills you. And so we've got to sort of try and understand why it is that people think those things. Clearly, hospitals aren't made for killing people, but clearly a lot of people die in hospitals. So it's kind of perhaps a failure of understanding the difference between correlation and causation is the one thing. But the other is also just, of course, in reality, once somebody is sick enough to go to hospital, they could be on death's door, and therefore in the community they're associated to that hospital, the association with that hospital is death. So we've got to sort of trying to get a bit of an understanding of why people believe these things. In Zambia, there's another example of how news coverage sort of displays to us. There was an HIV prevention trial in Zambia, and some of the news coverage was absolutely devastating for the scientists who had done magnificent work. How a headline like that comes about, once again, my belief is that we've got to try and understand how it came about. So the story really said that it was the trial itself that caused people to be infected by HIV. But if you were familiar with clinical trials and randomized controlled trials, which you are, of course, you'll know that, obviously HIV prevention trials are conducted in settings with high HIV incidence. And over any given period of time in those settings, some people will seroconvert, they will become HIV positive. That's why the trial is being conducted in that setting. If the journalist doesn't understand the rationale of the trial or how the trial was reported on, the journalist, as in this case, might think that it meant that those who enrolled in the trial seroconverted or became HIV positive as a result of the trial. This misunderstanding has been devastating for the science community in Zambia, and there is this one is in Zimbabwe, and there was a similar. This one was in Zambia, and there was a very similar example in Zimbabwe as well. The Zambia one was so severe that for several years, about 3 years or so, it was really difficult for the science community to introduce any new HIV prevention trials, even though it's a high prevalence country, really, and with great research infrastructure. In other words, the perfect setting to conduct vitally needed clinical trials. Then we're all familiar with the with the vaccines cause autism, what shall I call it, nonsense. That has led to this day to the fact that, I think the World Health Organization recently declared vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 health threats in our world. Vaccine hesitancy comes from if we go to the next slide, you may recall that the study that was reported on in the Lancet in 1998, which drew a spurious conclusion between vaccine use and autism. 12 years later, it took a whole 12 years for the Lancet, and many have said it was way too late, for the Lancet to actually retract that study. And that is now already 9 years ago. But to this day, the idea persists that vaccines cause autism. So once again, we've got to try and understand why it is that the first incorrect narrative seems to prevail, even though the study has been retracted, even though there's such clear evidence of vaccines working. If we go to the next slide, I think one of the reasons why some of these myths and misperceptions persist is some of the science is difficult to understand. The Zambia trial I mentioned, if people are not familiar with randomized controlled trials, they may not understand what the findings mean. Subhra mentioned how it is that scientists report on findings and how different it is for journalists. So first of all, if they're not familiar with that structure, if they're not familiar with the science language, these misunderstandings will come about. And then also a second reason why people do believe the things they do is sometimes the truth is hard to hear. Time and again in our internews program called Information Saves Lives that we had in Liberia, we heard people said Ebola was not real, and yet it was incredibly real. Whoever got, 2/3 of those who were in any way exposed to the virus died. But it's an incredibly difficult thing to believe and to accept, especially if it's something new. If your family members have died, one may think that makes it easier to accept and embrace. But at the same time, it can be so hard to hear this that it's better to turn away and pretend it isn't true. And then when we go to the next slide, when it's difficult to understand, so perhaps we may think, well, what do we do? Let's just dumb down the science. Let's just pretend it's for that 8-year-old or 5-year-old. And of course, people quickly notice that you're doing that because people have some kind of understanding. They have schooling. They have this real lived experience. So I think what we should do with the science is not to dumb it down, but to break it down. And there really is a difference. So a lot of what we do in the journalism training we do, both for journalists and also for scientists in terms of how to do this, is how do you break down science? How do you make sense of statistics? How do you use ways to communicate that, just are the way that you would tell the story to your own child or to your wife or husband? How many scientists are in a very specialized field of science and perhaps criticize what they see in the news media? But if they're to be really honest, perhaps just give up on even telling the story to their wife about or husband, what it is that they're doing. But in the beginning of enthusiasm about a new project or about a clinical trial being launched, you would find a way to tell that story to a neighbor or a friend who doesn't know science. And that's the way that we need to help our audiences understand the story. So it's 2 steps removed for a scientist, obviously, because first you need to find the journalist, as Subhra explained, and then perhaps, help the journalist break it down further for their audience. When it's difficult to understand, that applies to a lot of science. When I spent time in Liberia during the Ebola crisis there, it became clear that people were fascinated with the fact that this was a zoonotic disease, that there was an initial, that initially the vector came through bats and wild animals that people were eating. But it's very difficult for people to understand that doesn't mean to say if you eat a bat now, you will get Ebola. It's not like that at all. Of course, it's human to human transmission. And the process is quite complicated. And also sometimes, again, it's difficult. It's hard to hear if, for instance, something in somebody's diet or something about their cultural practices exposes them to disease. So it can be both difficult to understand and hard to hear. So another thing we should bear in mind is that some of the terms that we use just sort of roll off the tongue of any clinical scientist, and one wouldn't think twice about talking about an adverse event if you're somebody working in clinical trials, or to talk about whether say for instance a treatment naive patient. So to a scientist, we all know what a treatment naive patient is, somebody who's never been on treatment. But the word naive is a familiar word, but not the term treatment naive to a so-called ordinary person. So to them, it sounds like you're saying they're naive, they're unsophisticated, or they're stupid. So in other words, a lot of the terminology that really have a real meaning and sort of is completely relevant in the world of science just doesn't apply to ordinary speech, and it can be really difficult to remember that. So one of the tools I propose is to have a science buddy, or to be a science buddy. So Internews, when we do journalism training, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the term sort of, perhaps, I hope, says it all, just about the fact that when you're writing about science, you need, and you're a journalist. In other words, you're a generalist. You're not somebody skilled in that field. You need somebody that you can turn to. You need a trusted scientist friend. And believe you me, it's not easy for journalists to actually try to make those connections. But everyone who's done so is just so delighted. And a science buddy is somebody who just understands the general world of science, knows scientific method, knows how scientists think. So the story could be about tuberculosis, but your science buddy might be a malaria expert. But a malaria expert will nevertheless know whether what you wrote about TB, what you're writing about TB as a journalist, makes sense. So that's what a science buddy is. In other words, beyond reading and researching and kind of preparing for the interview, what Subhra mentioned, I would say try and cultivate a buddy who you can really trust to help you with your story. And that story might have nothing to do with the interests or, with a scientific interest or specialization of the buddy, but they will nevertheless be able to tell you whether the science is accurate. Another way to address this is, of course, training. Training is perhaps an overused word, and at Internews, we hardly even ever call what we do training anymore, because we have networking events, we have health media cafes, science media cafes, roundtable discussions. We have sessions where journalists, scientists, and members of civil society meet and exchange what it is that they have in common and the common challenges that they face in communicating this. But some kind of form of training, exposure, or learning is important. Subhra mentioned something very similar, and I just want to also say that the use of metaphors is incredibly useful. Again, it gets back to how would you tell this story to your wife, husband, neighbor? What is it that you're doing? I mean, some of the examples Subhra mentioned are about, magnificent one-off world events, and they are the big stories in science. But there are also the small stories in science, which for us would be something like, just the incremental steps that our research take when we take it forward. And they can easily be explained in terms of metaphors. For instance, why does it take long for a vaccine to be developed? It's a little bit like baking a cake. It has to, first of all, you've got to try out different recipes until you find one that works perfectly. And then that cake needs to be baked for a long time in the oven. One of the communicators we work with in a program I work on with the advocacy organization AVAC, based in New York, uses that metaphor when he goes into a community where people know about baking but don't know about the processes involved in designing a vaccine. So let's go to the next slide. We spoke about metaphors, and after that, this is just a different version of saying what Subhra said earlier. In journalism, we talk about the inverted pyramid. So scientists in the audience will recognize that the way that this pyramid looks is the opposite of the way their science writing looks. Science writing starts with the general background. And the conclusion, what is the conclusion in science writing, is for us the news angle. So we just literally flip it all around, and of course the method and some of the background would simply be in the middle, in the bulk to all of them. But that has been handled already. So we'll go to some of the other slides. Very important in terms of why is it that people believe the things they do is sometimes the truth is hard to hear, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so what we do at Internews is to say that when people seem to not want to hear what the science says, when they don't follow best practice, for instance, the introduction of voluntary medical male circumcision as an HIV prevention, if a community has not traditionally circumcised, it's an incredibly difficult shift to make, to say, well, from now on, it will prevent HIV acquisition for men if they are medically circumcised. You can imagine that it is shrouded in so much cultural background that to just simply say that a certain community should start circumcising isn't easy. So it might be hard to hear. So what we do is to say, well, what you do when you try to figure out why people believe what they believe or don't come around to the best science is to simply listen. Listen to what their fears are. Listen to what their perceptions are about the disease that you hope to address with the intervention, with the solutions that you hope that your science will bring. Just listen to them. And listen again. In the next slide, you see a picture from South Sudan where we work with these motorbikes. They're called Boda Bodas. And those are news or information motorbikes. So the rider there and the journalist who is with him go around, and yes, in journalism we interview, we listen to what people say, and we reflect back either in a radio news story or in a print story or whatever the case may be. But in this case, in South Sudan, it's a humanitarian, it's an ongoing humanitarian situation. So what these internews staff members are doing here is to just actively listen. Listen to what the children are saying about access to water. What are they saying about, about nutrition? Why is it that it's difficult for them to go to school? I mean, you can see what kind of environment it is. Don't assume what the reasons may be. Listen and listen again. So in many of the settings, we just listen. In Liberia, where the Ebola crisis happened, our journalists sat down in the marketplace where women were selling their vegetables, at church, in the mosques, and just listened carefully to why people believed the myths that they did believe. And then out of that grew a beautiful project called They Say. So They Say is sort of Liberian English for they say or hearsay. In other words, once we had done all the listening and we had started to form some of the trends ourselves, we realized we needed to systematically listen, both with empathy, but also in a way that we could gather all of the responses, and then to know what kind of information do we need to use to either debunk myths or to get people to start talking about the facts about Ebola, rather than to be so obsessed with what they think might be true about Ebola. So in this rumor tracking system, we would get information via SMS, and journalists would help us gather the information, and we would literally have trends and certain strands of information that we would then respond to. But now we've said sometimes it's difficult to understand the science, and then we have different methods to try and overcome that. And sometimes it's simply a message that's hard. Sometimes the message is simply hard to hear. Now, in an upcoming trial, of which the results will be released in July, called the ECHO trial, which really looks at the relative risk or if so, of various means of contraception for family planning, will have a result I can almost predict that will be both difficult to hear and perhaps also hard to hear. In other words, the science will be difficult, but also the implications might mean that people may have to change their mode of contraception, or it might mean governments must change their policy, or it might mean that none of the above is relevant, and that's sort of hard to understand. Well, why did such an expensive trial take place at all if nothing's going to change? So sometimes these two collide, and that's when our job becomes really critical. So as Internews, AVAC, and a whole host of other organizations, IAVI and others, I know there is incredible engagement at the moment. FP 2020, in other words, a major family planning coordinating organization, and the HIV community are looking at how we will work with journalists, other communicators, community advocates, civil society, faith-based organizations, to communicate what these trials mean, what the results of the trial actually means. And, the depiction there, once again, as a scientist, well, just to give you some background, in case you're not familiar with ECHO, is the fact that the observational studies have shown there is approximately a 50% probability. Do you want me to stop soon? I mean, I can see Debbie is asking us to wind up, and that's actually fine, because I think if we end with this thought that sometimes the science is difficult and the findings and the implications of the findings are hard to swallow, it calls on us to bring to bear all of those tools we mentioned. We must be a science buddy. We must use metaphors. We must find ways to break down the science for our community. We must listen and respond in a way that's appropriate. So the two last slides just serve as inspiration. One is to say that the science community often takes a huge amount of effort to provide feedback about the results of a finding, the results of a trial once the findings are known, to the very communities who participated and those surrounding the participants in the trial. So this is one of those examples. So this is just the last phase in a process we called GPP, or good participatory practice. In other words, what is the good ethical practice of a clinical trial? Is to not only involve journalists and others, but the very communities who are making the trial possible, from before the recruitment right until after the results have been made known. And this is just one of those examples. And I think just ending on the fact that at Internews, we call, it's so interesting because I work on our health portfolio, is that so many of our projects have something like the words information and saving lives in them. One project is called Information Saves Lives. The other one is called Information for a Better Life, and Information for Health. I think all of these things are true. I think we do need to think, though, about how that information is disseminated, how it's communicated, and then truly both scientists and journalists together are saving lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ida. And I'm really sorry we had to cut you a little short, but we do have a few questions here. Though most of the questions that the participants had shared were registering, our speakers have been gracious enough to answer both the questions, or most of the questions. I do see Shreya has a question to both the speakers. Could either of the speakers discuss a little about present opportunities for funding and formal training of early career science journalists in Asia and Africa? Ida, Subhra, any one of you could answer this, or both of you could answer that.
Okay, so in India, we just launched something with Wellcome Trust, which is called the India Science Media Fellowship, which is the first ever media fellowships in India, where we choose 5 journalists from across the country through a very competitive application process, and hone them, or try to sort of create science-engaged journalists, instead of just journalists who are into investigative or political or any other beat of journalism. So we try to create the temperament within them to look at stories through the lens of science. And so the first batch has just been rolled out, and they've gone into the fields, and hopefully they'll be producing a strong body of science journalistic work in the next 6 months to come. That's from India. In Asia, I know there are some fellowships. One of them is the Asia Environment Science Award, which is given out by don't remember the exact institute, but I think it is a Singapore-based institute which gives out that award. It identifies environment journalists who look at environment through the lens of science again. So those are the two off the top of my head that I can hear, that I can remember. Ida.
Sure. Yes. I mean, since you mentioned in the environment, on the internews side, there's also a lovely program called EJN, or Earth Journalism Network, and you can find it by simply googling EJN or Earth Journalism Network. They always have grant and fellowship opportunities. Sometimes global, sometimes a specific sub-region, sometimes a specific country, reporting on obviously climate issues and environmental issues. On the health science side, our opportunities at internews tend to be country specific. So we may have a health journalism training program in Kenya, for example, as we had recently on family planning and reproductive health. And then there are two ways to get into that program. The one is to write to us via our website, which is www.internews.org. But the other is also that our trainers, they're always journalists who are health science journalists or health nerds or science nerds, make a point of looking at the stories that are already being published. In other words, your story sells you. If your story looks compelling, it looks like you care, and you've got a good head and heart for science, then our journalists would nominate you for further training programs and further opportunities. But at the moment in sub-Saharan Africa, these are in several countries, so Zimbabwe, Zambia, Uganda, DRC, Guinea, and so on. So it's best to just refer to the website. Otherwise, I would subscribe to a newsletter by the organization IJNet, so International Journalism Network, IJNet, and look for the opportunities that they publish regularly. A lot in health science.
I also wanted to mention the World Federation of Science Journalists website. That's WFSJ. If you just Google WFSJ, you'll find the website, and there are many such opportunities listed there as well.
Thank you so much, Ida. Thank you so much, Subhra. Thank you everyone who joined us today. I know, I would again like to thank Ida and Subhra for your time and for sharing your insights and expertise. This really has been a very helpful session. If you have additional queries, questions, if you would like to get in touch with us, that's our ID there on the screen. We would love to hear your feedback as well. Thank you for your time, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye. Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.